NASA's Artemis 1 Orion spacecraft just made it back to Earth after the long, exciting journey it had. It went much further beyond the moon, and now that it's back, we're going to get our hands on all the details and look at them in this video. We'll also be looking at the very best parts of the Artemis 1 mission. Spoiler alert, the best parts were very hard to narrow down. Let's dive right in. First up, let's look at the spacecraft being opened. After the Orion spacecraft was successfully collected from its splashdown location on December 11th and returned to NASA facilities in Florida on December 30th for processing, the Artemis 1 mission has finally been declared a success by NASA. Right now, NASA experts have opened up the Orion capsule and started to review everything to see how the 1.4 million mile journey was for the spacecraft. They're going to assess the damages and how sustainable the whole thing was. All of this was announced on NASA's blog on its website. The space agency even posted a picture showing a worker standing inside the crew module and inspecting the interior, along with removing any payloads. NASA also took it a step further by taking out Snoopy, their zero-gravity indicator, and any intentional passengers. Of course, these weren't real people, but rather mannequins with different sensors that will tell NASA the kind of impact being in space for so long could have on humans and their health. The reason that humans weren't aboard Artemis 1 was that it was purely a reconnaissance mission to collect as much information as possible to help NASA plan out future Artemis missions. Next up, more about Artemis 1. The Orion spacecraft, Space Launch System, also known as the SLS rocket, and ground systems were all tested during Artemis 1. Here's a fun fact for you. Did you know that this mission used to be called Exploration Mission 1? Considering how far we're advancing, Artemis 1 is only the first of a series of more difficult future missions. It was simply an unmanned flight test that kind of laid the groundwork for future deep space exploration with humans on board. If anything, this mission just shows our capacity and willingness as humans to go to the moon and beyond. The spaceship took off on the best rocket on the planet and ended up traveling farther than any human-built spacecraft has ever gone. Over the course of a month or so, it journeyed 280,000 miles from Earth and many thousands of miles beyond the moon. Up next, let's look at what they've found inside so far. Orion's door has been opened by technicians at NASA's Kennedy Space Center, also known as the KSC, located in Florida, and they've started taking out the payloads that went to the moon and back on the Artemis 1 mission. This isn't an easy job, and it's going to take a long time to complete. NASA officials let us know in an update on Tuesday, January 10th, that technicians will remove 9 avionics boxes from the Orion this week, which will then be renovated for Artemis 2, the first trip with astronauts. They also added that the technicians will be taking away any remaining hazardous materials from the spacecraft over the next few months. After this is done, the spacecraft is going to NASA Glenn's Neil A. Armstrong Test Facility in Ohio for environmental testing and abort-level acoustic vibration. Seems like a very long process. Given the tough conditions it encountered, the capsule's 16.5-foot wide heat shield, the largest of its kind ever flown, is drawing special attention. Orion's heat shield was tested in many ways and even experienced temperatures as high as 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit or 2,800 degrees Celsius. This happened during its re-entry through Earth's atmosphere on December 11th. That's insane because this is almost half as hot as the sun's surface. Moving on, let's move on to the highlights of the mission. The first major aim of launching a spacecraft fit for humans was the Artemis 1 mission and launching the Orion spacecraft flawlessly into space and sending it to the moon. Now that it's back, NASA released a reel of highlights all about the mission. The first thing in the video shows the launch, which was on the morning of November 16th. The rocket's powerful thrust pushes down on Earth and starts to lift the spacecraft as soon as all 6 engines fire. SLS is traveling at 128 mph after 30 seconds. NASA released an amazing video taken by a camera on the mega rocket during its ascent into space. 2 potent white side boosters are fastened to the side of the rocket's core orange side booster. These are crucial components of the craft because during the first several minutes of SLS's ascent into the atmosphere, they supply 75% of the thrust or force pressing down against Earth. However, after using up all of their fuel, the boosters suddenly and securely separate from the remainder of the rocket, including the Orion spacecraft on top of the SLS. Now for the other highlights. Orion's solar array camera captured a picture of Earth on day 1 of the Artemis mission as the spacecraft sped toward the moon. By then, Orion was already a whopping 57,000 miles away. The Orion capsule also took some stunning pictures from just 80 miles above the lunar surface about a week into the mission. The pictures revealed that the moon is a desolate landscape, dotted with craters and hills all over. This is really interesting, especially because NASA believes that some of the craters on the moon might just be rich in water ice. This is going to be needed for the next deep space missions. Orion also accomplished a remarkable milestone on day 13 of the expedition, when its orbit around the moon brought it 268,563 miles away from Earth. This is honestly awesome. The spacecraft was also 40,000 miles above the lunar surface in this orbit, which is known as a far-off retrograde orbit. This allows it to occasionally look back at Earth and our natural natural satellite. In order to swing close to the moon and ultimately set Orion on the path to return to Earth, the Orion spacecraft fired its engines, performing what engineers refer to as a burn about 3 weeks into the voyage. Orion also passed within 80 miles of the moon on its closest approach, providing clear pictures of its craters and rough surface. Coming up, more about the craters on the moon. Artemis 1 showed us the craters of the moon up close. You can see Aristarchus and Herodotus, two huge craters, clearly in some of the pictures that were released. You can also see some curving lines on the craters, which are probably collapsed lava tubes. These are basically just lava flows that produce tunnels. Places like Hawaii, on Earth of course, have many lava tubes. All this information that's been discovered from the mission is so fascinating because science has shown that the moon has a rich volcanic history, with volcanic eruptions happening in the last 100 million years. Let's move on to Orion coming back. The Orion capsule fell through the atmosphere of Earth straight into the Pacific Ocean on December 11th. The burned-out spacecraft was then recovered by the waiting USS Portland of the Navy, full of crew members from both the NASA and Navy. The highlight clip by NASA also shows Orion on its 25.5-day voyage for Artemis 1 after the launch, showing that it was capable of flying in a far-off retrograde orbit around the moon and successfully returning to Earth. The final test of re-entry and splashdown on Sunday, December 11th, during which Orion's 11 parachutes opened for a gentle glide into the Pacific Ocean, is shown in the final segment of the reel. With that, Artemis 1 was in the bag. This is a significant step in NASA's plans to go back to the moon. Now that this is over, we can't wait for the next Artemis launch. It might happen sooner than we think in 2024. Let's talk about what's so special about this footage. Throughout its entire mission, the gate opener mission for the bigger Artemis mission has given us some amazing footage that shows Earth and the moon from many hundreds of miles away. NASA also streamed a live video from deep space for a month, which made the whole experience so much better. It felt like we were all astronauts. When you think about it, all this is so different from past missions like the Apollo program. The videos were released much later and weren't in color. As for the missions that were in color, they were rarely in 4K. We also weren't able to experience a Star Wars-style event when the launch abort system ripped off in front of a cockpit video. That's definitely a plus. Following up, the future Artemis missions. Now that this first Artemis mission is over and the findings are on their way, NASA is going to start prepping for the Artemis 2 mission. This one will send an astronaut crew around the moon in 2024, and honestly, we can't wait. Before Artemis 3, which is scheduled to send normal humans to the moon's surface in around 2025, the following mission will be a very important test of life support systems on the spacecraft. The crew of Artemis 2 will be launched on an 8-day trip using the massive Space Launch System mega rocket and the Orion spacecraft. Seems exciting. To see how well the Artemis program works in taking people to the surface of the moon, the astronauts and mission controllers will gather data on Orion and the crew's performance. Finally, what's next for NASA and the rest of the Artemis missions? Thanks to the success of Artemis 1, it's fair to say that Artemis 2 is going to happen. It will have a human crew and basically be the same mission as Artemis 1, but with astronauts on board. All the data collected during Artemis 1 will be used to lower any risk for Artemis 2. Of course, all this hasn't been retrieved yet, but as we talked about, NASA has all hands on deck for it. The real goal, the major mission, is Artemis 3. It's going to be NASA's first official trip back to the moon with astronauts in many years. Before returning to Earth, these astronauts will land on the moon, gather samples, and do more astronaut-y stuff. All this is definitely very surreal and exciting, and we space nerds just can't wait for it. That's a wrap for this video. What do you think of NASA's latest Artemis 1 mission and what they've found so far? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.